Hello and welcome to Moon Lodge Mingle. My name is B. La Rosa and I am the owner of Moon Lodge Mystic, located in the Pacific Northwest. I am a compassionate depth worker who uses spiritual tools like tarot and Vedic astrology to help people navigate the challenges and experiences that meet us on this journey we call life. My professional background is in human services, particularly disability services and advocacy, and my spiritual inspirations draw from an eclectic mix of Jungian psychology, depth psychology, Eastern philosophy, and earth-centered pagan practices. I created the Moon Lodge to be a haven for people searching for practical, grounded solutions that invoke meaningful and enduring transformation. I launched this podcast to give myself a platform for sharing the wisdom, experience, and knowledge that I think will be helpful to the kind of people who get drawn to my work. In this first episode, I want to introduce myself and my history and give you a sense of what to expect from the show going forward. This podcast will be a seasonal format, 8 episodes, launching from May to December most years. It's going to be a solo podcast, mostly me just giving my thoughts on different topics and getting into a rambling state. And occasionally there may be guest appearances, especially with my husband, if there are ever topics coming up around relationships. And the topics are pretty much going to range from anything from astrology to shadow work to just general metaphysical practice and spiritual philosophies. Anything that really feels relevant to my audience and the work that I'm doing, I'm willing to talk about it and give my thoughts. So if you are really interested in paganism, spirituality, philosophy and psychology, shadow work, and all that good stuff, then hopefully you will enjoy my podcast. So now I will just talk about myself and kind of just share my story. I grew up in the Seattle area and I was raised in a pretty dysfunctional household. I'm not going to trauma dump here, but suffice to say, my dad was an alcoholic and had multiple substance abuse issues throughout my life, and my mom was pretty unavailable in a variety of ways throughout that life. It wasn't all bad. There was actually a lot of complicated experiences of really immense value that I had, especially with my dad, which is probably why it took me such a long time to really recognize the abuse that I had lived through. I remember being a teenager and just really kind of convincing myself or talking about the struggles I was going through as if this was all just normal and that there wasn't really anything wrong with me, that I wasn't actually being abused or anything like that. Even though I had a really strong sense of justice and unfairness that was happening, I always yelled and fought back whenever I was being unfairly treated. But I just had somehow normalized it to myself in such a way that made it very challenging to recognize. And I think part of that also was because, like I said, I had a really positive relationship with my dad when he wasn't drinking or doing drugs. He was a very involved father. I have a lot of great memories of him. He used to take me to the library and we would check out books, especially drawing books. I was so into artwork. And then we would go home and he would sit with me at the table and help me learn how to draw the things in the book and help me learn how to trace drawings or I remember having a cat book, learning how to draw cats. And he just was really patient with me and really encouraged all of my hobbies and interests. He also regularly told me how much he loved me and how proud he was of me. And he always chaperoned my field trips. He always showed up at school on my birthdays and brought cakes for me to share with my whole class. He seemed to really genuinely enjoy and find a lot of satisfaction and purpose out of being a father. He just was a deeply traumatized individual and he didn't know how to deal with that. It, of course, doesn't excuse some of the things that I lived through with him, but it did give me something to salvage out of the relationship growing up. And my dad died a few years ago now, just towards the middle or end of COVID. And I would say, even though I eventually had to go no contact with him, we I feel more at peace with the relationship that I had with my dad and the things that we went through together than I do at present with my mom. Presently, I am in no contact with my mother, and a lot of that is just because she can't seem to have an honest dialogue with me about the problems in our relationship, which is something that I could have with my dad. Now, my dad was a jerk. He really was just a straight up asshole in a lot of ways, but he never tried to pretend or refuse to acknowledge that he did some fucked up shit in our household. He always owned up to what he did for the most part, even if he really sucked at it sometimes. And you always had the sense that he wished that he could be doing better. And I guess I'm getting into detail about this because it speaks a lot to how the complex layers of that relationship gave me the things that I really needed in my personality that eventually led me to my spiritual path and healing journey with my own therapy and metabolizing all this trauma that I lived through growing up. I actually wrote a blog post about my relationship with my dad after I had watched the movie The Whale. It came out after my dad died, and when I saw it, was just a mess in the parking lot, sitting in my car, crying, just ugly crying because of how relatable the movie felt to the relationship I had with my dad. And you can read that blog post. I'll include it in the description because I think it gives a lot of good information about who my dad was and what he lived through that ended up making him the person that was able to influence me in both negative and profoundly positive ways. I ended up focusing a lot on my dad, but my mom, I mentioned, was really unavailable, and that just kind of describes our relationship. I don't have a lot of substance there to pull from like I do from my dad. And this was something that was really difficult for me to parse through over the years, like in my young adulthood, because during in the background of my dad having a chaotic and volatile personality, my mom seemed like the good guy. And a lot of times I would just by default align myself with her and not recognize how she had pretty much enlisted me as her personal therapist. So, honestly, a lot of my memories about my mom involve me pretty much being in a caretaker position towards her, trying to take care of her feelings and consult her through her struggles, while I kind of was just left alone to figure everything out on my own. So, for the longest time, I guess what you would call my mother wound kind of set really deep outside of my awareness for a long time. I had to work through a lot of my anger towards my dad before I could access the issues that I had with my mom. After my dad died, I had kind of hoped that with him out of the picture, that she would kind of shift in her orientation towards me and be more emotionally available, but that wasn't the case. So I have learned that this is more about these are more features to her than they are just circumstantial issues. And it became a clear decision for me that I needed to just cease contact with her. I'm kind of laughing at myself because this was supposed to be like a biographical retelling of my life. And it's pretty much just me talking about the significance of the relationships with my parents and how they impacted me, which I guess is what is meant to be conveyed anyways. So I'll just stick with this. It did say that I'm not going to trauma dump, so I'm not going to get into a lot of details. I'm not going to say in detail what happened to me. That's not really necessary. What's helpful is to know that my mom was emotionally unavailable and my dad was emotionally all over the place. He was supportive and also totally just abusive. I will say my dad has never been physically or sexually abusive towards me, but it was all verbal, emotional. It was just the chaos of being the daughter of somebody with profound unresolved trauma and substance abuse issues. He wanted so badly to be functional and to be the father that he never had in life. And based on his experience, I would say he did a really good job of that. He really did the best he could in a way that makes me feel loved. And I can't really say that same thing about my mom. So that's pretty much just the summary of my parental experiences. And that has shaped the backdrop of my life, my path in life. I ended up going to college right away out of high school. I was essentially planning my escape since I entered high school. I kept a running Excel sheet. I had investigated the different colleges in my area. I knew what credits I needed to earn in high school. I did the running start in college and high school programs. And I was keeping track of what credits transferred to what degree programs that I was interested in so that I could graduate as soon as possible and be financially independent as soon as possible. That is essentially what my strategy was as an adolescent, was get the hell out of Dodge and sever as much dependence from this family as I possibly can. Freedom is the number one pursuit. Let's do this. So I started out, initially I was going to be like a psychiatric nurse or a neurosurgeon or something. I originally went to college to study neurobiology. I dropped out of my first year and came back home. I had traveled to Boston and started completing my degree in human services instead. And during that time, I got a job as a caregiver tending for adults with developmental disabilities in home settings. And they also had a lot of challenging behaviors. It was a lot for me to deal with. I have to say, I went into caregiving strictly because I did not want to work in retail. Am I pleased with the decision? I think maybe younger me, I could have told myself retail wasn't that bad. At least it wasn't the same kind of challenging that caregiving would give me. Now, don't get me wrong, I have always loved my clients and cared a lot for them. But caregiving is hard. It's hard because of the structural challenges and infrastructure surrounding it. There's not a lot of protection for workers and or resources available for coping with more of the challenging behaviors that can come up. And because of that, burnout was just kind of inevitable. So I transitioned away from caregiving after a few years and pivoted into employment support services. This was after I got my degree in human services. I started working as a job coach for adults with developmental disabilities again. This was such a big shift for me because my whole life I had been a horrendous nail biter. I would bite my nails down to the quick. They would be bloody stumps most of the time. And when I quit that caregiving job and started my new job as a job coach, oh my gosh, within a few months I noticed that my nails were growing and that I had not felt the urge to bite them since quitting that job. So that was the first time in my life that I had experienced such a reduction in stress that I didn't feel like mutilating my fingers all the time. That's a really big deal. I believe I was 23. I'm 34 now, and I was about 23 when I first got that job. And it was 23 years that I lived in a state of so much stress and tension that I was chewing my nails down to the stump on the regular. It was a constant habit for me. This was also around the time that I married my husband, Nova. And my husband, as well as a coworker that I met at this new job, are the ones who introduced me to metaphysics. Now, I feel like I want to back up here a bit because I missed the whole arc of the development of the interests that brought me to the work that I'm doing now. And it goes like this. The simplest way to say this is that my dad was a drug dealer when I was younger, before I was born. And his specialty was LSD and weed. And so my dad had done a lot of psychedelic drugs, and he told me all of his stories as I was growing up. And they were fascinating to me. And he told them in a way that was valuable. My dad was a wonderful storyteller. I loved listening to him talk about his life. He went on so many crazy adventures. And so he would be telling me about these trips that he had. And then he also introduced me to all this music and books and everything that he loved. And it was really, for me, it was a positive thing. It was just very interesting to hear him talk about these experiences. And so I got super interested in psychology and altered states and things like that from a very young age. And I would say definitely from middle school onwards, I was super into learning about psychology. I had already learned about Freud and Jung, and I was researching the counterculture movement of the 60s. I was super hyper fixated on classic rock bands, especially Pink Floyd. And I was watching all of those indie movies like Waking Life, Requiem for a Dream, things like that. And I was very profoundly drawn into the world of studying perception, the dark side of human nature. I really just wanted to learn how people work. And I was even interested in astrology at the time, but and mythology. I've always loved mythology. So I was already really primed to enter metaphysics when I met my husband. But at the time when I met him and we got married, I was pretty agnostic. I could not really be convinced that there was an immaterial dimension to reality, which is how I describe this to people now. When they ask, how do you think this is all real? How does this all work to you? The answer is that it's not going to be comprehensible because it exists fundamentally in an immaterial dimension of reality that cannot be directly observed, which is very convenient. It really just leaves it all up to faith. But I didn't understand that at the time. So when my husband told me that he journeyed to the astral plane and could talk to spirits and visit other worlds and stuff like that, I thought he was full of shit. I thought, no, you're dreaming, but you think you're awake or something like that. You're just lucid dreaming. There's no way you are just traveling somewhere else. And I could kind of see him feel a little like down about my reaction, but he was just like, whatever, I know what I know, you just don't know. But what really changed my perception was during our honeymoon, we traveled to Crater Lake. And while we were at Crater Lake, first of all, I was totally unprepared for that trip. I had read the forecast and it said, oh, it's going to be 60 degrees. And I thought, wow, that's pretty comfy. I'll just pack my sunny clothes. And yeah, no, I had completely neglected to consider the fact that we would be at the top of a mountain and that the forecast I was reading was for the bottom of the mountain, the foothills of the mountain. So we're at the top of Crater Lake and it's snow everywhere. And all I have are like little capris and short. I don't have a winter jacket or anything like that. And we're in our little cabin and we're standing out in the parking lot and me and my husband are hanging out because the reason we went here was that I wanted to do stargazing and I had chosen some destinations for us to go to where the light pollution was very minimal and it was going to be around the new moon and all that stuff so that we could actually stargaze very well. So we were outside looking up at the dark sky. And if you've never been to Crater Lake, if you've never been to the top of a mountain, it's pretty much like, even though there's cabins and it's like a little, like a visitor center there and stuff like that, there's attractions, it's still the deep wilderness. And back then, I used to be really afraid of, you could never camp solo. For the longest time, I couldn't camp without a man present because I would be too scared. I got over that a few years ago, but so at the time, I'm sitting here outside. I'm like, babe, I'm scared that there's like mountain lions out here or something like that. And he's like, oh, just give me a second. And he shuts his eyes and just looks like he's about to take a nap or something. And he comes out of this trance state. And I'm like, all right, so what was that? He's like, well, I talked to the land spirit here. And it started telling me all this stuff about how there's a war between good and evil going on, and all this other stuff about the history of the land. And I told it, oh, I don't want to hear about that. I just wanted to ask you if there were any dangerous animals nearby that we should know about. And it told me that there was just some deer and that there's nothing to worry about. And I was like, okay. So then we went inside and I looked up the information he told me that the spirit had told him about the land. And I found that it was verbatim, word for word, the indigenous origin myth of Crater Lake. So this was something that me and my husband both had no prior knowledge of coming to Crater Lake. We had not looked into the mythology of the area or the region. So the fact that my husband was able to like shut his eyes and be distant for a bit and then come back and tell me that he spoke to a spirit that told him all this stuff, and it was like verbatim the origin myth of this place, to me was the evidence that I needed that he wasn't just full of shit about his astral traveling and whatnot. So that really opened the door for me to, it kind of just gave me permission to believe in stuff. And I've still always been really cautious when approaching metaphysics because frankly, people just make shit up. And there's no, like I said, when we're talking about spiritual experiences, it exists outside of the realm of observability. It's just something you can experience, but you don't get to study it in a third person observational type of way, the way that you can look outside and keep track of objective observable phenomena, because like I'm saying, the mechanisms are immaterial. So in any case, that launched my spiritual journey. And some years after that, I had still kept learning. I had been exposed to a lot of different sources of knowledge and philosophies and things like that. And I was partaking in psychedelic experiences. I was not new to this. I've worked with plant medicine multiple times since being a teenager. That shouldn't be surprising based on what I shared about my dad. But at one point, oh gosh, let me try and remember what year it was. Yeah, it was 2019. I remember because it was a Seattle Snowmageddon year. This is important because it's the reason I was able to get through this part. But I had a very profound psychedelic journey where I had confronted the part of myself that was extremely paternalizing, extremely controlling and critical. And I kind of pushed back on it and been like, you know what, you're not going to control me anymore. And I'm here to reset and restructure the structure of my psyche here. And it's going to be more balanced, more feminine from here on out. And that trip was amazing. It brought me in touch with a lot of material that related to the complexes that I had around my father and around identifying as a woman. But the thing is that after that trip, I just returned to my usual life, like nothing really happened. And a few months later, that is when the fallout happened. That is when the dark night of the soul appeared in my life. I had started having nightly panic attacks. I used to smoke weed. I would suddenly get very paranoid, very anxious, no longer relaxed. So I decided to quit cold turkey. Now, back then, I totally believed that weed is not addictive and there's no dependency issues and whatever. I learned that was not the case for me. After quitting cold turkey, I lost my appetite. But because I was so convinced that stopping weed would be a non event, I started freaking out and having terrible anxiety that I was living through some type of health event. So I remember seeing doctors and trying to rule out things like cortisol issues or diabetes and stuff like that. Meanwhile, during this week of the dark night of the soul, I am having horrific borderline psychosis, or I wouldn't say borderline. I never actually approached that real line, but my anxiety felt like it. The dissociation I felt from the anxiety was so intense that it made me feel like I was losing my mind. And yeah, multiple severe panic attacks. There were days where I was just on the floor and all I could do was lay on the floor as close to the ground as possible and just try and visualize peaceful energy going down my body all day long. And that was all I could do, because any attempt to think about things, any attempt to look at stuff, watch TV, browse social media, or anything like that, it was too triggering. I would have panic attacks. I could not watch cartoons. They were triggering me. I could only watch Judge Judy during the day. And the Snowmageddon part is important because while this was happening, I had the perfect excuse to call out of work for a week straight while my life fell apart. Because during the Snowmageddon, there was no work to do. And so using my vacation time and sick pay was an ideal thing from the perspective of my bosses. And I didn't have to get detailed about why I could not work for a week. Just little things like that in retrospect, I feel like there was something within me that knew that was the perfect time to break down. And so it took the opportunity, because what I found was the reason I was having all of these panic attacks, having all this existential terror around, like, how do I know anything is real? How do I know the sun is going to come up tomorrow? How do I know that I'm not the only person that can think in the world and that everyone else is just a hallucination? I went through the whole ringer of reality collapsing thoughts. All of that was happening because I was resisting the cathartic emotional release that psychedelic trip was trying to guide me towards. Everything shifted when one day the awareness suddenly popped into my brain that I was sad about the life I had lived, the way that people had treated me in my life, the fact that I had been bullied all throughout my life, not just by my family, but by friends, by people in school, by people online, that I had felt extremely isolated and outcast my whole life, that there are people that I really loved and adored, that I would have done anything for, that treated me awful. And for the first time in my life, I felt the pain that those experiences caused me. And I cried for 7 hours straight. I was just in my bed sobbing. And that was the first night during that whole experience that I was able to go to sleep without having a panic attack. And I had later realized that it was the loss of control, the sensation of losing control while slipping into the altered state of consciousness of sleepiness. That was what was triggering my panic attacks. So that is what brought me to therapy. That was my dark night of the soul of experience. And I went to therapy after that. First, I started in hypnotherapy just to get a baseline. I had to regulate my nervous system because I was just a total anxious mess. Then I met my actual therapist that I worked with for several years. And she also helped me ground myself, center myself into a spiritual practice. She taught me a lot about embodying emotions and being in touch with my deeper self in a way that just my mere intellectual consumption of psychology content and things like that couldn't touch. I had to have a therapist actually teach me how to recognize that I was dissociating in my body, how to name my emotions and things like that. And she had also identified that I had no relationship with something greater than myself in my life. I used to have a severe phobia of deity worship and any type of deity work, even anything having to do with God, which was very strange to me because I had no religious trauma growing up. I was raised Catholic. I'm an Irish Catholic. I still identify ethnically as an Irish Catholic. And I loved being Catholic growing up. I had no negative experiences with it. So I couldn't figure out where this phobia had come from. But I started out, I couldn't have figurines in my space. I was too scared. But eventually I bought a figurine of just a nameless, faceless, very generic goddess of compassion. And that was the opening for me to enter into my spiritual practice. Once I included her in my altar space and got used to the idea of having a relationship with her, I realized that I was safe, that I wasn't going to be harmed by doing this work. And I started branching out. I started working with Ganesha. And then I had already encountered Kali in my psychedelic trip. And I've worked with many other different gods and goddesses since then, especially Persephone, Lakshmi, Bridget, and the Morrigan. And somewhere along the way, I started studying Vedic astrology. I had already studied astrology for many years, and kind of parallel with all this development, I had learned Vedic astrology and tarot. And I started my blog, the Moon Lodge Mystic. I started out just doing tarot polls and astrology forecasts, and eventually started writing other blog content similar to the way that I'm going to be approaching this podcast. And then I eventually started working at events. I left my job coaching career at the end of COVID and became a full-time stay-at-home wife and used that time to build my business and develop my practice as a channeler working local events and festivals. And so now here I am. The mission for Moon Lodge started, it's an expression of my purpose and path in life, but it was also inspired by a specific issue that I encountered in my professional work. I struggled a lot in my career with wanting to change the system, with seeing a path where everyone could be better, but having troubles with finding any type of conceivable or feasible way forward, because in politics, everybody's really reactive. It's highly polarized. It's ineffective. Nobody's willing to negotiate with each other. Nobody's willing to make concessions and things like that. And I'm not saying there's not good reason for that, but to me, the core of this problem is that people on a societal level, collectively, are digging deeper and deeper into their polarities as a reaction formation towards each other. And it's been like spiraling out of control over the last 15 years in particular. And I just feel that there's no way forward for humanity, particularly like in the United States, until people have done their inner work, have done their shadow work, have learned to metabolize the traumas and the grief and the experiences that have made them armored up and guarded over life. Once people can make peace with that, then they're going to be able to have dialogue around more difficult conversations around like, how do we run our society? How can we come to an agreement about what structures need to be implemented for the good of our culture and society and all that? So that is one reason why I pivoted away from human services and advocacy work into spiritual healing and sacred witnessing. In a way, I like it more because I have more autonomy. I have more agency over how I invest my energy into the people I work with. There's a huge difference between being a reader and meeting with someone maybe once, maybe a few times, and having a structured opening and closing to what this work is and what it will accomplish in their life, versus having an ongoing caseload, an ongoing relationship with people. It's way less intensive emotional labor for me. And so I don't ever get burnt out by this work that I'm doing. I think the only time I've ever felt burnt out from it was when I was doing festivals every other weekend. That was just too much physically on my body. And so I've been moving away from events and trying to get more into private spaces. I'm working on finding a healing space and do guided cacao journeys for people. That's the kind of container that I'm shifting into. And this podcast and my newsletter are part of that. A way for me to keep generating the content that can reach people who can't afford to book a session with me, and be able to get my ideas out there and hopefully help some people reach a more balanced state of being in life. Because the more that everybody does this, even just a little bit, the more we can achieve, I guess I won't say world peace, but if just more people did their inner work and learned to understand and contextualize their challenges in a way that feeds them rather than depletes them or leaves them feeling guarded and triggered and unsafe and things like that, the world would just be a better place. It just would be. And that was kind of what Carl Jung was saying when people used to ask him what he thought was going to happen to humanity, whether we were doomed or not. And he would always say, as long as everybody is accountable to their inner work, we're going to be fine. We're going to find resilience. So that's the philosophy that I lead my work with. And that was an introduction to me and my background. I feel like I was kind of all over the place. This is my first recording. I have ADHD. Even though I used an outline, I just got into a talky, rambly space, and that was what I was going for. I feel like I talk the best when I do that. So hopefully that was enjoyable for you all. And my next episodes are going to be an introduction to shadow work and what is shadow work, and also an episode about light workers and shadow workers and what they are, how they operate, and how to relate to them. So that's all I've got for now. Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to Moon Lodge Mingle. If you found this valuable, please consider sharing it with a friend who might need it. You can find more content through my blog and newsletter at moonlodgemystic.com. If you're interested in a tarot or Vedic astrology reading, or you'd like to work one-on-one in a personalized cacao journey, you can book through my website. Until next time, take care.